A billionaire walked into the nursery and found the housekeeper asleep on the cold floor, holding his baby in her arms. He stood frozen, speechless, and what he did next shocked the entire mansion. Secrets long buried began to rise, and one small act of kindness became the spark for a story of redemption, emotional healing, and unexpected love. This isn't just a story, it's a journey of second chances, family, and the quiet strength that lives in those who are often overlooked. Get ready, because what you're about to witness will touch your heart in ways you never expected. The Australian winter rain pelted against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Whitmore Estate, a sprawling modern mansion perched on the cliffs of Sydney's exclusive Palm Beach. The steady drumming of water against glass was the only sound that filled the otherwise silent nursery, save for the occasional crack of thunder that illuminated the room in brief flashes of silvery light. Ethan Caldwell stood in the doorway, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the polished hardwood floor. His eyes, the color of storm clouds, widened at the sight before him. There, on the plush cream carpet in the center of the nursery, lay Grace Mitchell, his recently hired housekeeper. She was curled on her side, a thin blanket pulled over her shoulders, and in her arms, sleeping peacefully, was his 6-month-old daughter, Sophie. "What is this?" The words escaped his lips before he could stop them, his Australian accent thickened by exhaustion and surprise. Mrs. Whitaker, the estate manager who had worked for the Caldwell family for over 20 years, appeared behind him, her face a careful mask of professional concern. "Why is she sleeping on the floor with Sophie in her arms?" Ethan's voice trembled, not with anger but with something far deeper, something he couldn't quite identify. Mrs. Whitaker hesitated, her hands clasped tightly in front of her crisp uniform. "Sir, she didn't want the baby to be alone tonight. There was a storm, and the crib hadn't been delivered yet." Ethan stepped into the room, his footsteps silent on the thick carpet. The nursery, which he had commissioned but rarely visited, was a testament to tasteful luxury. Pale blue walls adorned with hand-painted clouds, custom furniture crafted from sustainable Tasmanian oak, and a collection of stuffed animals that had never been touched. He knelt beside Grace and Sophie, studying them in the dim glow of the nightlight. Grace's chestnut hair fell across her face, and her arms were protectively curled around the baby. Sophie, wrapped in a soft muslin blanket, slept with her tiny hand resting against Grace's collarbone. They breathed in unison, peaceful despite the thunderstorm that raged outside. The sight stirred something within Ethan, a feeling he had buried 3 years ago when his wife Isabel had passed away after a brief, devastating illness. It was an ache, a warmth, a crack in the wall he had built around himself. "She's been doing this often?" he asked quietly, not taking his eyes off his daughter. Mrs. Whitaker moved closer, her voice soft. "Most nights for the past 2 weeks, sir. Since the night of the first big storm, Sophie was crying and none of us could settle her. Grace, well, she has a way with her." Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing this information. He had been away for most of those 2 weeks, closing a major acquisition in Melbourne. The tech empire he had built from scratch, Caldwell Innovations, demanded his constant attention, his unwavering focus. It was easier that way, easier than coming home to empty rooms and memories. "Should I wake her, sir?" Mrs. Whitaker asked, already moving forward. "No," Ethan said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "Let them sleep." He stood and moved to a cabinet near the window, pulling out a cashmere throw blanket that still had its price tag attached. With careful movements, he draped it over Grace and Sophie, ensuring they were both covered. "Sir?" Mrs. Whitaker's eyebrows rose slightly, the only indication of her surprise at this unexpected tenderness from her usually distant employer. "Have the crib delivered tomorrow," Ethan said, his eyes still on the sleeping pair. "And have maintenance turn up the heating in this room. It's too cold for them." "Yes, sir." Mrs. Whitaker nodded, watching him with a new curiosity. Ethan lingered a moment longer, then turned to leave. At the door he paused. "Mrs. Whitaker, what do we know about her, about Grace?" The older woman's expression softened. "She came highly recommended, sir. Worked for the Harrington family in Melbourne for 5 years before moving to Sydney. Quiet, efficient, keeps to herself. The references said she's especially good with children." "And why did she leave the Harringtons?" Mrs. Whitaker hesitated. "She didn't say specifically, sir. Just that it was time for a change." Ethan nodded, his mind already filling with questions about the woman who had somehow connected with his daughter in ways he had failed to do. "Thank you. That will be all for tonight." As he walked down the corridor toward his study, Ethan felt something shift inside him. The mansion had been silent for so long, silent since Isabel's laugh had faded from its halls, silent despite the arrival of the daughter they had planned for together, the daughter Isabel would never meet. But tonight, for reasons he couldn't explain, the silence felt different. It felt like the pause before music begins. In his study, surrounded by awards and the trappings of his success, Ethan poured himself a glass of water, not the whiskey he might have chosen in the past, and looked out at the storm-tossed Pacific Ocean. Lightning illuminated the churning waves, and in their rhythm he found himself thinking not of acquisition strategies or stock prices, but of a woman sleeping on the floor of his home, holding his child as if she were the most precious thing in the world. And perhaps, he thought as he pressed his forehead against the cool glass, she was. 6 months earlier, Grace Mitchell had stood at the imposing gates of Whitmore Estate, a small suitcase in hand and uncertainty in her heart. The property sprawled before her, all clean lines, glass and stone, a modern architectural marvel that seemed to both challenge and embrace the rugged Australian coastline it occupied. "You must be Grace," Mrs. Whitaker had said, appearing at the gate with a tablet in hand. "Right on time. We appreciate punctuality at Whitmore." Grace had nodded, offering a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you for the opportunity, Mrs. Whitaker. It's a large property," the estate manager had continued as they walked up the curved driveway, lined with native Australian flora. 12 rooms, 6 bathrooms, 3 kitchens, pool house, home theatre, Mr. Caldwell's private office suite, and of course, the nursery. At the mention of a nursery, Grace had faltered slightly in her step, but Mrs. Whitaker didn't notice, continuing her efficient tour. "Mr. Caldwell is rarely home. He travels extensively for business. When he is here, he prefers minimal disruption. The baby arrived 3 months ago. We have a nanny who comes during weekdays, but she doesn't live in. You won't be expected to care for the child except in emergencies." Grace had absorbed this information silently, noting the clinical way Mrs. Whitaker referred to the baby, as if the child were another piece of furniture to be maintained rather than a living, breathing person. Now, as dawn broke over Whitmore Estate, and Grace woke to find herself still on the nursery floor, she felt a moment of disorientation, followed by a rush of embarrassment. Sophie was still sleeping peacefully in her arms, but something was different. A soft cashmere blanket, one she had never seen before, was draped over them both. Someone had found them during the night. Carefully, so as not to wake the baby, Grace sat up and looked around. The storm had passed, leaving behind a pristine morning sky visible through the large windows. The room was warmer than it had been when she'd settled on the floor with Sophie, who had been inconsolable during the thunderstorm. The door opened quietly and Mrs. Whitaker entered with a tray. Her expression was unreadable as she set it down on a side table. "Good morning, Grace," she said, her voice lower than usual. "I've brought tea and some toast." Grace carefully adjusted Sophie in her arms. "Mrs. Whitaker, I can explain." The older woman raised a hand. "Mr. Caldwell saw you last night." Grace felt her heart sink. 6 weeks into her new position, and she had already overstepped her boundaries. "I understand if he wants me to leave. Sophie was so distressed by the storm and the crib still hasn't arrived. I only meant to stay until she fell asleep, but—" "He's ordered the crib to be delivered today," Mrs. Whitaker interrupted, her tone gentler than Grace had ever heard it. "And he's asked for the heating to be increased in this room." Grace blinked in surprise. "He's not upset?" Mrs. Whitaker's lips curved into the ghost of a smile. "I've worked for Mr. Caldwell since before he made his first million. In the 3 years since Mrs. Caldwell passed, I've never seen him look at anything the way he looked at you and Sophie last night." Before Grace could process this information, Sophie began to stir in her arms, tiny eyelids fluttering open to reveal eyes the same stormy grey as her father's. The baby made a soft cooing sound, her small hand reaching up to touch Grace's cheek. "Good morning, little one," Grace whispered, the warmth in her voice a stark contrast to the cool efficiency she maintained with the rest of the household. Mrs. Whitaker watched them for a moment. "The crib will be here by noon. Mr. Caldwell has also requested that you join him for dinner this evening." Grace looked up, startled. "Me? Why?" "He didn't say," Mrs. Whitaker replied, moving toward the door. "Just be in the main dining room at 7. I'll watch Sophie." After Mrs. Whitaker left, Grace gently placed Sophie on the changing table, speaking softly to her as she changed her nappy and dressed her in a pale yellow onesie. "What am I going to say to your father, sweet girl?" she murmured, lifting the baby to her shoulder. "How do I explain that I couldn't bear to leave you alone?" Sophie responded with a happy gurgle, her tiny fingers curling into Grace's cardigan. The rest of the day passed in a blur of routine household tasks, though Grace found herself distracted by thoughts of the upcoming dinner. She had barely spoken 10 words to Ethan Caldwell since her arrival at Whitmore. He was a shadow, a presence felt rather than seen, his impact on the house evident in the pristine technology that controlled everything from lighting to security, but his physical presence as rare as rain in the outback. At precisely 6:55, Grace stood outside the main dining room, wearing the only dress she had brought with her to Whitmore, a simple navy blue wrap dress that had once been her favorite. She had stopped wearing it after everything had changed, but tonight it felt right to wear it again, even as her hands trembled slightly at her sides. The door opened, and Ethan Caldwell stood before her, tall and imposing in dark trousers and a light blue button-down shirt, with the sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms. His dark hair was slightly damp, as if he had just showered, and his expression was one of careful neutrality. "Grace," he said, her name sounding different in his deep voice. "Please come in." The dining room was smaller than she had expected, intimate even, with a table set for two by a window overlooking the ocean. The sun was setting, casting the room in shades of gold and amber. "I believe this is the first time we've properly spoken," Ethan said as he held out a chair for her. "I apologize for that. I haven't been present." Grace sat, acutely aware of her position as an employee, of the boundaries that existed between them. "There's no need to apologize, Mr. Caldwell. I understand you're very busy." Ethan took the seat across from her, his eyes so like his daughter's, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away. But she didn't. "Mrs. Whitaker tells me you've been caring for Sophie during the storms," he said as a member of the kitchen staff appeared, silently to pour water into crystal glasses. Grace nodded, her fingers twisting the napkin in her lap. "Yes, she seems frightened by the thunder. I hope I haven't overstepped." "You slept on the floor to comfort my daughter," Ethan said, his voice quiet but clear. "That's not overstepping. That's kindness." The simple words hung in the air between them, unexpected and sincere. And in that moment, something shifted in the carefully maintained distance that had defined Whitmore Estate for so long. The following weeks brought subtle changes to Whitmore Estate. The crib arrived, a handcrafted masterpiece of Tasmanian oak with delicate carvings of native Australian animals along its rails. Sophie now slept in it most nights, though Grace still found herself in the nursery during storms, sitting in a plush armchair beside the crib, her hand resting gently on Sophie's back until the thunder passed. The dinner with Ethan had been brief but cordial, focused primarily on Sophie's care and routine. He had asked thoughtful questions about his daughter's preferences, which songs she responded to, what toys captured her attention, how she liked to be held. Simple questions that revealed the vast distance between father and child, questions that a more involved parent would never need to ask. Grace had answered honestly, describing Sophie's fascination with a stuffed koala, her delight when sung to, her preference for being carried facing outward so she could observe the world around her. "She has your eyes," Grace had said impulsively, then immediately blushed at her forwardness. But Ethan had merely nodded, a flicker of something, pain, recognition, crossing his features before he composed himself again. Isabel always said our children would have the Caldwell eyes. It was the first and only time he had mentioned his late wife during that dinner, and Grace had not pressed for more. Now, 3 weeks later, Grace pushed Sophie's pram through the estate's extensive gardens, which were bursting with native flora, banksia, grevillea, and kangaroo paw, creating a tapestry of color against the deep blue of the Pacific beyond. The winter chill was giving way to spring warmth, and Sophie was awake and alert, her tiny hands reaching toward the vibrant blossoms. "That's a waratah, little one," Grace said, pointing to a striking red flower, the floral emblem of New South Wales. "And over there are bottle brush trees. See how they look like the brushes we use to clean bottles? Your bottles, in fact." Sophie gurgled happily and Grace laughed, the sound carrying on the sea breeze. "She likes your voice." Grace turned, startled to find Ethan standing a few meters away, dressed casually in jeans and a light sweater, a tablet in his hand. The sight of him outside his office during daylight hours was so unexpected that for a moment she simply stared. "Mr. Caldwell, I didn't realize you were home today." He approached, his eyes on Sophie, who was now wriggling excitedly in her pram. "I had a video conference cancelled. Thought I'd work from the terrace for a change." He hesitated, then added, "And please call me Ethan. Mr. Caldwell makes me feel like my father." Grace nodded, acutely aware of the narrowing distance between employer and employee, of invisible lines being redrawn. "Ethan, then." He knelt beside the pram, bringing himself to Sophie's eye level. The baby regarded him seriously for a moment, then broke into a gummy smile, her small arms waving. "Hello there," he said softly, offering his finger, which Sophie promptly grabbed with surprising strength. Something flickered across his face, wonder, perhaps, or recognition, before he looked up at Grace. "She's growing so quickly." "Babies do," Grace replied, then added more gently, "but they also remember. Voices, faces, connection. It's never too late to build that." Ethan stood, reclaiming his finger from Sophie's grip. "I haven't been what she needs." The simple admission hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable in a way Grace hadn't expected from this man who controlled empires with a keystroke. "You're her father," Grace said. "That's exactly what she needs." They continued walking through the garden together, falling into step. Naturally, as Grace pointed out different plants and birds to Sophie, who watched everything with wide, curious eyes, Ethan remained largely silent, but he was present, observing the interaction between his housekeeper and his daughter, with an intensity that suggested he was taking mental notes. At a small stone bench overlooking a koi pond, Grace stopped to adjust Sophie's sun hat. Ethan sat, placing his tablet beside him. "May I ask you something personal, Grace?" he said after a moment. She tensed slightly but nodded, focusing on securing the hat's strap under Sophie's chin. "Mrs. Whittaker mentioned you worked for the Harrington family in Melbourne before coming here. Why did you leave?" The question was direct but not unkind, his tone genuinely curious rather than accusatory. Still, Grace felt her heart quicken. "It was time for a change," she said, the same answer she had given during her interview. She straightened, meeting his gaze with a steadiness that belied her inner turmoil. "The Harringtons were good employers. I simply needed a fresh start." Ethan studied her face, and Grace had the distinct impression that this man, who had built his fortune on understanding data, patterns and predicting technological trends, was reading between her carefully chosen words. "A fresh start," he repeated thoughtfully. "I understand those." A cry from Sophie broke the moment. Grace immediately turned her attention back to the baby, lifting her from the pram and cradling her against her shoulder. "She might be hungry," Grace explained, already beginning to rock Sophie gently. "It's nearly time for her midday bottle." Ethan stood, hesitating for a moment before saying, "May I? Would it be all right if I tried to feed her today?" The request was so unexpected that Grace momentarily lost her professional composure. "You want to feed her? I should know how," he said simply. "I'm her father." The words she had spoken to him just minutes ago reflected back at her with a determination that transformed his features, making him appear younger, less burdened by whatever weight he carried. "Of course," Grace said, smiling. "We can go to the kitchen. I'll show you how to prepare her bottle." As they walked back toward the house, Sophie still fussing softly against Grace's shoulder, something shifted again in the carefully maintained balance of Whitmore Estate. A father wanting to feed his child shouldn't be remarkable, Grace thought, and yet, watching Ethan's nervous anticipation as they approached the house, she couldn't help but feel she was witnessing something significant, a small but crucial turn in a journey that had only just begun. The kitchen at Whitmore Estate was a chef's dream, all sleek surfaces, professional-grade appliances, and panoramic views of the coastline. It was here, among the stainless steel and marble, that Grace showed Ethan how to prepare Sophie's bottle, guiding him through the process with patient instruction. "Not too hot," she explained, as he tested the formula on his wrist. "Just warm enough." Ethan nodded, his concentration absolute, as if he were analyzing complex code rather than preparing infant formula. When the bottle was ready, they moved to the adjoining family room, a space that, despite its name, showed little evidence of family life. No photographs adorned the walls, no personal mementos cluttered the surfaces. It was beautiful, but impersonal, like a high-end hotel suite. Grace settled into an armchair and began to hand Sophie to Ethan, but hesitated. "Have you ever held her for feeding?" A flush of color appeared high on his cheekbones. "No," he admitted. "The nanny usually handles it when I'm home." Without judgment, Grace nodded. "Sit down, and I'll show you how to position her." Ethan lowered himself onto the sofa, his usual confidence replaced by a tentative awkwardness that was almost endearing. Grace gently placed Sophie in his arms, adjusting his hold until the baby was secure, her head cradled in the crook of his elbow. "Support her head like this," Grace demonstrated, "and hold the bottle at an angle so she doesn't take in too much air." As Sophie began to drink, her tiny hands reaching up to touch the bottle, Ethan's expression transformed. The guarded tech mogul disappeared, replaced by a man seeing his child, truly seeing her, perhaps for the first time. "She has Isabel's nose," he said softly, his voice catching, "and her determination." Grace sat in a nearby chair, giving them space while remaining close enough to assist if needed. "Tell me about Isabel," she said, the question gentle, an opening rather than a demand. Ethan was quiet for so long that Grace thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice was low, his eyes never leaving Sophie's face. "She was brilliant. A marine biologist specializing in coral reef restoration. We met at a climate tech conference in Brisbane. I was presenting on sustainable energy solutions. She was challenging every tech CEO in the room to do better." A small smile touched his lips. "She called me out specifically, said my carbon offset program was, and I quote, a band-aid on a bullet wound." Grace smiled, picturing the scene. "And you fell in love with her for that?" "Not immediately," Ethan admitted. "First, I tried to hire her as a consultant. She refused, said she wouldn't be corporate greenwashing. 6 months later, we were engaged." Sophie had finished her bottle. Without prompting, Ethan carefully shifted her to his shoulder for burping, the movement awkward but determined. "Pat, gently," Grace instructed, just between her shoulder blades. As he followed her guidance, Ethan continued. "Isabel wanted children right away, but we were both so busy. She was establishing her research foundation. I was expanding Caldwell Innovations into Asia. We decided to wait until the timing was better." His expression darkened. "There never is a perfect time, is there?" Grace felt a sharp pang. In her chest, memories threatening to surface. "No," she said quietly. "There isn't. When she got sick, it happened so quickly. Stage 4 ovarian cancer, already metastasized. She had been ignoring symptoms, focused on her work." Ethan's voice remained steady, but his eyes glistened. Before the end, she asked me to promise we'd still have our child. We had frozen embryos from earlier fertility treatments. She made me promise not to let her illness be the end of our plans." Sophie burped softly, and Ethan's tense shoulders relaxed slightly. He adjusted her in his arms, cradling her once more. "So you found a surrogate," Grace said, understanding now the pieces of the story she had wondered about. Ethan nodded. "Sarah, a wonderful woman from Adelaide. She stayed in Sydney during the last trimester, so our doctors could monitor the pregnancy closely. When Sophie was born," he trailed off, his expression clouding, "I should have felt joy. Isabel wanted me to feel joy, but all I could think was that she should have been there, that Sophie would never know her mother." The admission hung in the air, raw and honest. Grace found herself reaching out, briefly, touching his arm before drawing back, remembering her place. "Sophie will know her mother through you," she said, "through the stories you tell, the values you share, the love you show her. That's how we keep people alive, for those who never got to meet them." Ethan looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing beyond the role of housekeeper to the woman beneath. "You speak from experience." It wasn't a question, but Grace answered anyway, offering a small piece of herself in exchange for his vulnerability. "Yes." She didn't elaborate, and he didn't press. Instead, they sat in a companionable silence as Sophie drifted to sleep in her father's arms, her tiny chest rising and falling with each peaceful breath. Later that evening, after putting Sophie down for the night in her new crib, Grace retreated to her small suite in the staff wing of the estate. It was comfortable but modest, a bedroom, ensuite bathroom, and a small sitting area with a desk by the window overlooking the garden. From the bottom drawer of the desk, she withdrew a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with her neat handwriting. Lyrics, melodies, notes, scribbled in margins. She opened to a blank page and began to write, the words flowing from some deep well within her. Sleep now, little one, under southern stars. The waves sing you lullabies from afar. Though the world may seem vast, and the night may seem long, remember you're loved, and that love makes you strong. She hummed the melody softly, imagining it sung to Sophie, to another child she had once held, to all the children who needed to know they were not alone in the darkness. The song was a promise, a prayer, a piece of her heart transformed into sound. Outside her window, unseen in the shadows of the garden path, Ethan Caldwell paused on his evening walk, caught by the faint melody drifting through the partially open window. He listened motionless until the humming stopped and the light in Grace's room went out. Only then did he continue on his way, the gentle tune following him like a memory, or perhaps a possibility, of something he had long thought lost to him forever. A month passed, bringing with it the full bloom of Australian spring. The jacaranda trees that lined the driveway of Whitmore Estate erupted in a haze of purple blossoms, their fallen flowers creating a lavender carpet on the white gravel below. Inside the mansion, subtler changes were taking place, changes that Mrs. Whittaker observed with quiet interest. Ethan was home more often now. His business trips, once stretching for weeks at a time, had shortened to mere days. When at Whitmore, he could frequently be found in the nursery during Sophie's wake hours, awkwardly but earnestly engaging with his daughter under Grace's gentle guidance. "She likes when you make silly faces," Grace had suggested one afternoon, demonstrating with an exaggerated expression that made Sophie burst into delighted giggles. Ethan, the man whose stoic portrait graced the covers of business magazines, had hesitated only briefly before contorting his features into a comical grimace. Sophie's resulting laughter, a bubbling, uninhibited sound, had transformed his face into something younger, lighter, as if years of carefully maintained reserve were melting away. On this particular morning, Grace was in the garden with Sophie, who at nearly 8 months old had become increasingly mobile, crawling with determination across the blanket Grace had spread on the manicured lawn. The baby was fascinated by a monarch butterfly that had landed on a nearby flower, her chubby hand reaching toward it with wonder. "Gentle, sweet girl," Grace murmured, demonstrating a soft touch on Sophie's palm. "Some beautiful things are very delicate." "An important life lesson," came a voice from behind them. Grace turned to find Ethan approaching, dressed not in his usual business attire but in casual clothes, jeans and a simple button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He had been working from home more frequently, sometimes even bringing his laptop to the garden to work, while Grace and Sophie played nearby. "Good morning," Grace greeted him with a smile that came more naturally now. The rigid formality that had once defined their interactions had gradually softened into something more comfortable, not quite friendship, but a warm collegiality. Built around their shared care for Sophie, Ethan lowered himself to the blanket, immediately capturing Sophie's attention. The baby abandoned her pursuit of the butterfly and crawled toward her father with impressive speed, pulling herself up, using his knee for support. "Look at you, standing like a champion," Ethan said, his voice warm with pride. He glanced at Grace. "When did she start doing this?" "Just yesterday," Grace replied. She pulled herself up on the coffee table in the family room. She was quite pleased with herself. Ethan beamed at his daughter, who was now bouncing slightly on her unsteady legs, babbling happily. "At this rate, you'll be running the company by next year, won't you, Sophie?" Grace laughed, then caught herself, still occasionally uncertain about the boundaries of her position despite their evolving dynamic. But Ethan didn't seem to mind. In fact, his expression suggested he enjoyed the sound. Their peaceful morning was interrupted by Mrs. Whittaker, who approached across the lawn with uncharacteristic haste, her usually composed features tight with tension. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, coming to a stop at the edge of the blanket. "I apologize for the interruption, but there's someone at the gate insisting on seeing you. A Miss Claire Lawson." The effect of the name on Ethan was immediate and startling. His body tensed, his expression hardening into a mask that Grace hadn't seen in weeks. Sophie, sensitive to the sudden change, whimpered and reached for Grace, who automatically gathered her close. "What does she want?" Ethan's voice had cooled to the professional tone he used for business calls. Mrs. Whittaker glanced briefly at Grace before answering. "She says it's regarding the estate." "She was quite insistent, sir," Ethan stood, brushing invisible lint from his jeans. "I'll speak with her in my office. Please show her in, Mrs. Whitaker." The estate manager nodded and retreated toward the house. Ethan turned to Grace, his expression guarded but apologetic. "I need to handle this. It might take some time." Grace nodded, curious but professional. "Of course. Sophie and I will stay out here a bit longer. The fresh air is good for her." Ethan hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "Claire is Isabel's sister. We haven't been on good terms since Isabel passed." The explanation was unexpected, a personal detail offered voluntarily, another small brick removed from the wall between them. Before Grace could respond, Ethan was striding across the lawn toward the house, his relaxed demeanor replaced by the tense posture of a man preparing for battle. Later that afternoon, as Grace was preparing Sophie's dinner in the kitchen, raised voices drifted down the hallway from Ethan's office. Though she couldn't make out the words, the tone was unmistakably confrontational. She focused on mashing sweet potatoes for Sophie, trying not to eavesdrop, but the tension in the house was palpable. Mrs. Whitaker entered the kitchen, her lips pressed into a thin line as she put away a tea service that had clearly gone untouched. "Is everything all right?" Grace asked, unable to contain her concern. The older woman sighed, uncharacteristically dropping her professional reserve. "Family matters are rarely simple, especially when there's money involved." Before Grace could inquire further, the sound of heels clicking sharply on marble announced a new presence. A woman appeared in the kitchen doorway, tall, slender, with the same honey-blonde hair that Grace had seen in the single photograph of Isabel that Ethan kept in his office. But where Isabel's expression in that photo had been warm and open, this woman's features were sharp with displeasure. "So this is the new help," she said, her gaze sweeping over Grace in assessment. Grace straightened, wiping her hands on a tea towel. "Hello, I'm Grace Mitchell." "Claire Lawson," the woman replied coolly. Her eyes landed on Sophie, who was sitting in her high chair, happily smearing some sweet potato on the tray. Something flickered in Claire's expression, a softening perhaps, or a sadness quickly masked. "And this is Isabel's daughter." The way she said it, Isabel's daughter, not Ethan's daughter or my niece, struck Grace as deliberate. "Would you like to meet Sophie?" Grace offered, sensing a complexity to this woman's feelings. That went beyond the obvious tension with Ethan. Claire approached the high chair cautiously, as if Sophie might disappear if she moved too quickly. "She has the Caldwell eyes," she said quietly. "But that smile, that's pure Isabel." Sophie regarded the stranger curiously, then offered a sweet potato-covered hand in greeting. Claire laughed despite herself, a sound so similar to the laugh Grace had heard in Ethan's rare reminiscences about Isabel that it was startling. "She's not afraid of making a mess, I see," Claire observed. "Good. Isabel always said life was too short for pristine fingernails." "Claire!" Ethan's voice cut through the moment. He stood in the doorway, his expression controlled but his eyes betraying his discomfort at finding his sister-in-law with Grace and Sophie. "I thought we were finished." Claire straightened, her momentary warmth vanishing. "For now, but this isn't over, Ethan. Isabel wanted—" "I know what Isabel wanted," he interrupted, his voice tight. "Better than anyone." An uncomfortable silence fell over the kitchen. Grace instinctively focused on Sophie, wiping the baby's hands and face with a damp cloth, giving the adults the illusion of privacy. "We'll talk again when your lawyers have reviewed the documents," Claire said finally, gathering her designer handbag from the counter. She cast one last glance at Sophie, something like longing flickering across her features before she steeled herself again. "Goodbye, Grace. It was interesting to meet you." After Claire left, escorted by Mrs. Whitaker, the kitchen remained silent, save for Sophie's contented babbling. Ethan stood by the window, tension radiating from his shoulders as he stared out at the garden, where just hours earlier they had been at peace. "Is there anything I can do?" Grace asked quietly, settling Sophie more comfortably in her high chair. Ethan turned, seeming almost surprised to find he wasn't alone. "No, it's complicated. Family business." Grace nodded, accepting the boundary. "I understand. I'll finish Sophie's dinner and then get her ready for bed." "Thank you." The words were simple but sincere. Then, after a pause, "Claire believes I'm not honoring Isabel's wishes for the estate. For Sophie." He ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of frustration. "The truth is, I'm trying to figure out what those wishes even were. Isabel had plans for a foundation, for research funding, for Sophie's future, but she didn't have time to finalize anything. The admission seemed to cost him, each word weighted with guilt and uncertainty. "What do you think Isabel would want?" Grace asked gently. Ethan's gaze returned to the garden, to the jacaranda blossoms swirling in the late afternoon breeze. She would want Sophie to be happy, to grow up knowing she was loved, to understand the importance of protecting the world around her. His voice grew softer. "She would want me to be present, not just providing." He turned back to Grace, his expression open in a way she had rarely seen. "You've helped with that, with making me see what really matters." The words hung between them, simple but profound. Before Grace could respond, Sophie banged her spoon on the high chair tray, demanding attention. The moment passed, but something in the air had shifted, another invisible thread connecting the three of them in ways none could have anticipated. The following weekend brought unexpected rain to Sydney, confining the residents of Whitmore Estate indoors. Grace had planned a trip to the nearby botanical gardens with Sophie, but instead found herself rearranging the nursery, organizing baby clothes that Sophie was quickly outgrowing and taking inventory of supplies. It was during this routine task that she made the discovery. While rearranging items in the nursery's built-in drawers, her hand brushed against something tucked in the back corner of the lowest drawer, an envelope, cream-colored and slightly yellowed at the edges. It hadn't been there when she'd last organized the drawers, of that she was certain. Grace hesitated, knowing she should simply place it on Ethan's desk and say nothing more. But something about it, perhaps the way it was hidden rather than simply misplaced, gave her pause. She turned it over in her hands and froze when she saw the handwriting on the front. "For Sophie's caretaker." Her hands trembled slightly as she carefully opened the unsealed envelope and withdrew a single sheet of paper covered in elegant handwriting. "To whoever is caring for my daughter, if you're reading this, it means I never had the chance to meet you, but you have met the person who matters most to me in this world. I don't know your name or your story, but I want to thank you for being there for Sophie when I cannot be. Ethan is a good man with a brilliant mind and a tender heart, though he keeps the latter well hidden. He will provide everything Sophie needs materially, but I fear he may retreat into his work rather than face the pain of raising our child without me. If that happens, please be patient with him. Grief makes strangers of us all. In the third drawer of my desk in the sunroom, you'll find a journal filled with letters to Sophie, things I want her to know as she grows, memories I want to share, wisdom I hope to pass on. Please make sure she receives these when the time is right. Ethan knows about the journal, but he may find it too painful to read. Take care of them both for me. With gratitude, Isabel Caldwell." Grace carefully refolded the letter, her vision blurred by unexpected tears. The date at the top of the page was from the final weeks of Isabel's life, a message in a bottle cast forward in time, hoping to reach whoever would be caring for her child. She returned the letter to its envelope and sat on the edge of the window seat, trying to process what she had read. The intimacy of it felt overwhelming, a connection to a woman she had never met, but whose absence shaped every aspect of this household. Sophie was napping in her crib, peaceful and unaware of the emotional currents swirling around her young life. Grace watched her for a moment, then made a decision. She needed to find the journal. The sunroom was at the eastern end of the house, a light-filled space with comfortable furniture and breathtaking views of the coastline. It was seldom used now, but Grace had noticed that Mrs. Whittaker ensured it was always impeccably maintained, as if preserving it for someone who would never return. The desk was a delicate antique piece with intricate inlays, distinctly different from the modern aesthetic that dominated the rest of the house. Grace approached it reverently, feeling like an intruder despite Isabel's letter. The third drawer slid open smoothly to reveal a leather-bound journal, its cover worn in a way that suggested it had been frequently handled. Grace lifted it carefully, torn between the feeling that she was trespassing and the clear directive from Isabel's letter. Before she could decide whether to open it, a voice from the doorway startled her. That was Isabel's favorite room in the house. Grace turned to find Ethan standing there, his expression unreadable as he looked at the journal in her hands. She felt heat rise to her cheeks, caught in what must appear to be snooping. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I found a letter in the nursery drawer. From Isabel, it mentioned this journal." She held out the envelope, her hand slightly unsteady. Ethan crossed the room slowly and took the Letter. His eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. His expression shifted as he read. Surprise, pain, and something like wonder crossing his features in quick succession. She always thought of everything, he said finally, his voice low. Always 3 steps ahead of everyone else. He looked at the journal Grace still held. I knew about that. She started writing in it when we first decided to have a child. Long before she got sick, after she was gone, I couldn't bring myself to look at it. Grace offered the journal to him. Perhaps now is the time. Ethan made no move to take it. She wanted it for Sophie. And for you, Grace said gently. She wrote to Sophie's caretaker, but I think she was also writing to you, giving you permission to share these memories with your daughter when you were ready. Rain pattered against the sunroom's glass ceiling, creating a gentle percussion that filled the silence between them. Finally, Ethan reached out and took the journal, his fingers brushing against Grace's in the exchange. Would you, he began, then stopped, seeming to search for words that didn't come easily to him. Would you stay while I look at it? In case. There's something Sophie should know now, even though she's too young to understand. The request revealed a vulnerability that touched Grace deeply. Of course. They sat together on the sunroom's window seat, the journal between them. Ethan opened it with careful hands, revealing page after page of Isabel's thoughts, hopes, and memories, letters to her unborn child, then to her future child, and finally in shakier handwriting, to the daughter she knew she would never see grow up. My darling Sophie, Ethan read aloud from one of the later entries, his voice steady, despite the emotion evident in his eyes. Today I felt you kick for the first time through Sarah's belly. Your father pretended he didn't cry, but don't believe him. He's a softy beneath all that tech genius exterior. A small smile touched his lips. She always saw right through me. Grace listened as Ethan continued reading selected passages, his voice growing more confident with each page turned. Isabel's personality emerged vividly through her words, her passion for the ocean, her sharp wit, her deep love for both her husband and the daughter she would never meet. In the middle of the journal, something fluttered to the floor, a photograph that had been pressed between the pages. Grace picked it up and handed it to Ethan, who stared at it in surprise. I've never seen this before, he said, showing Grace the image. Isabel, clearly ill but smiling radiantly, standing beside a hospital bed with her arm around a young woman who was unmistakably pregnant. Is that Sophie's surrogate? Grace asked. Ethan nodded, turning the photo over to read the inscription on the back. Sarah and I planning for Sophie's future. 2 mums of sorts. He looked up at Grace, his expression troubled. Isabel always referred to Sarah as Sophie's other mother. I think she wanted Sarah to remain part of Sophie's life, but after Isabel died, and then Sophie was born, it was so painful. Sarah moved back to Adelaide and we lost touch. Grace thought of Sophie, growing up without any maternal presence, and of Ethan, trying to be both mother and father while processing his own grief. It's not too late, she said softly, to reconnect, if that's what Isabel wanted, if that's what would be good for Sophie. Ethan closed the journal, his expression thoughtful. Maybe you're right. He looked at Grace with newfound appreciation. You have a gift for seeing what needs to be done, for understanding what people need. Sophie is lucky to have you in her life. The compliment warmed Grace, even as it reminded her of the temporary nature of her position. One day Sophie wouldn't need her anymore. One day this fragile connection she'd formed with both father and daughter would end. I'm the lucky one, she said simply, and meant it. As they sat there, the rain continuing its gentle rhythm on the glass above them, neither seemed in a hurry to leave the peaceful cocoon of the sunroom, a space that, for the first time since Isabel's passing, felt not like a shrine to what was lost, but a bridge to what might still be found. The discovery of Isabel's journal marked a turning point at Whitmore Estate. In the weeks that followed, Ethan spent evenings in the sunroom reading entries aloud to Sophie during her bedtime routine. Though the baby couldn't understand the words, she was captivated by her father's voice, her tiny hands often reaching for the journal's leather cover, as if somehow recognizing its importance. Grace would usually excuse herself during these intimate moments, giving father and daughter privacy for their connection with Isabel's words. But occasionally, Ethan would ask her to stay, seeking her perspective on particular passages, or simply desiring another adult presence as he navigated the bittersweet terrain of memory. On this particular evening, As Sydney's summer approached and the days grew longer, Grace was in her room after putting Sophie to bed. Her window was open to catch the jasmine-scented breeze, and she sat at her small desk with her own journal open before her. Unlike Isabel's journal of letters, Grace's contained songs, lullabies mostly, though lately she had begun composing pieces with more complex melodies and themes. A soft knock at her door interrupted her writing. She closed the journal quickly, a habit born of privacy rather than secrecy, and crossed the room. "Ethan," she said with surprise when she opened the door to find him standing there, Isabel's journal in hand. This was the first time he had sought her out in her private quarters. "Is everything all right? Is Sophie—" "Sophie's fine," he assured her quickly, still sleeping soundly. "I'm sorry to disturb you. I can come back tomorrow if—" "No, it's fine." Grace stepped back, opening the door wider in invitation. "Please come in." Ethan entered hesitantly, his tall frame making the modest room seem smaller. His gaze swept over the simple furnishings, the single bed with its blue quilt, the desk by the window, the small bookshelf filled with well-worn volumes. "I found something in Isabel's journal," he said, turning to face Grace. "Something I think you should see." He opened the journal to a marked page and handed it to her. The entry was dated just 2 weeks before Isabel's death. "My darling Sophie, today, I interviewed someone special, someone I hope will be part of your life, though I won't be here to make the introductions. Her name is Grace Mitchell, and there's a gentleness to her that reminds me of my own mother. She has experienced loss. I can see it in her eyes, but it hasn't hardened her. Instead, it seems to have deepened her capacity for care. I've hired her to join the household staff after you arrive, though Ethan doesn't know this yet. Mrs. Whittaker will handle the details when the time is right. I have a feeling, call it mother's intuition, though I haven't yet earned that title, that Grace will be important to you, and perhaps to your father as well, though he's too stubborn to recognize when he needs someone. Love always." Mum Grace looked up from the page, stunned. I don't understand. I never met Isabel. I interviewed with Mrs. Whittaker 6 months after—" Ethan nodded, his expression a mixture of wonder and confusion. "I know. That's what I thought too. But look at the date. And the description. It's unmistakably you." Grace sank onto the edge of her bed, the journal still open in her hands. "But that's not possible. The interview date on my employment records is from 6 months after she passed. Mrs. Whittaker handled everything." "I spoke with Mrs. Whittaker this afternoon," Ethan said, leaning against the desk. "She confirmed it. Isabel interviewed several candidates. Personally, before she became too ill, she chose you, left instructions that you were to be offered the position when Sophie came home, regardless of who else might apply later." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "She said Isabel was insistent that you were the right person, even though your experience wasn't as extensive as some other applicants." Grace's mind raced, trying to make sense of this revelation. "But I would remember meeting her. I would never forget something like that." "Would you?" Ethan asked gently. "Mrs. Whittaker mentioned that during your interview you were still recovering from some kind of trauma. She said you seemed distant at times, almost detached, though your interaction with the children in the household where you were working was warm and present." A chill ran through Grace despite the warm evening. Fragments of memory flickered at the edges of her consciousness, a time when days blurred together, when grief had wrapped her in a fog so thick she sometimes couldn't remember basic details of her daily life. "I was in a difficult place then," she admitted quietly. "After I left Melbourne, after I lost—" She stopped, the words sticking in her throat. Ethan moved from the desk to sit beside her on the bed, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "You don't have to explain. Not to me, not to anyone. But I wanted you to know about this connection, that you weren't here by chance. Isabel chose you specifically for Sophie." Grace traced the handwriting on the page, this tangible link to a woman she had no memory of meeting yet who had somehow seen something in her worth trusting with the most precious thing in her life. "Thank you for showing me this," she said finally. It means a great deal." Ethan nodded, his gaze falling on the journal lying open on Grace's desk. Her journal, with its notations and lyrics visible on the page. "You write music," he observed. Grace felt a moment of self-consciousness, but nodded. "Songs, mostly. It helps me process things. The humming I sometimes hear from the nursery when Sophie is falling asleep. Those are your compositions?" "Some of them," Grace admitted. Lullabies come naturally when you spend time with children. A comfortable silence fell between them, filled only by the distant sound of waves breaking against the cliffs below. Whitmore Estate. "Would you play something?" Ethan asked suddenly. "Not now, necessarily, but sometime. I'd like to hear your music properly." The request surprised her. "I'm not professionally trained or anything. They're just simple songs." "Sometimes the simplest things are the most profound," Ethan replied, standing. "Isabel used to say that complexity often masks a lack of real understanding." He moved toward the door but paused with his hand on the knob. "There's one more thing you should know. Claire is coming back tomorrow. Her lawyers have found some discrepancy in the estate planning. Something about Isabel's wishes for a foundation. I'm not sure what to expect, but I wanted to warn you." Grace appreciated the courtesy. "Thank you. I'll make sure to keep Sophie occupied if things become tense." Ethan's expression softened. "You always know exactly what's needed, don't you? Isabel was right about you." After he left, Grace returned to her desk and the open journal, but instead of continuing her composition, she found herself thinking about Isabel Caldwell, a woman who had apparently seen something in her that she herself had forgotten was there during the darkest period of her life. "Thank you," she whispered to the empty room, to a presence she couldn't remember meeting, but whose influence had led her to this place, to Sophie, to a sense of purpose when she had thought all purpose was lost. Outside her window, the stars of the southern hemisphere blazed in the clear night sky, ancient light traveling across vast distances, a reminder. The connections sometimes transcend the boundaries of time and memory, reaching us when we need them most. Claire Lawson arrived at Whitmore Estate the following morning with her lawyer in tow, a sharp-featured man whose expensive suit and perpetual frown suggested he charged by the minute and resented even necessary conversation. Mrs. Whitaker showed them to Ethan's office, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes conveying a silent warning to Grace, who was in the kitchen preparing Sophie's breakfast. "Perhaps you might take Miss Sophie to the beach cove this morning," the estate manager suggested quietly. "The tide pools are lovely this time of year, and the weather is perfect for an outing." Grace understood the subtext immediately. "I think that's an excellent idea. We'll pack a picnic lunch and make a day of it." She had Sophie dressed and ready in record time, the diaper bag packed with essentials, and was heading toward the service elevator that would take them directly to the path leading down to the private beach. Unfortunately, their route took them past Ethan's office, just as the door opened. Claire emerged first, her gaze landing immediately on Grace and Sophie. Something in her expression shifted, a softening that contrasted with her otherwise sharp demeanor. "Off somewhere?" she asked, her tone more curious than confrontational. Grace nodded, adjusting Sophie on her hip. "Just to the beach for some exploration. It's such a beautiful day." Claire seemed about to say something further when her lawyer appeared behind her, followed by Ethan, whose face registered relief at seeing Grace and Sophie. "Ms. Mitchell," the lawyer acknowledged with a curt nod, "I believe we'll be needing to speak with you as well, regarding your employment history." Grace felt a flutter of anxiety. "My employment history?" Ethan stepped forward, positioning himself slightly between Grace and the lawyer. "That won't be necessary, Mr. Bennett. Ms. Mitchell's employment arrangements are not relevant to the foundation discussions." "On the contrary," the lawyer replied smoothly, "given that Ms. Mitchell was apparently personally selected by Isabel, her testimony regarding any conversations about the foundation could be quite relevant." "I never," Grace began, then stopped herself. The journal entry had revealed that she had indeed met Isabel, though she had no recollection of it. What else might have been discussed that she couldn't remember? Claire was watching her with a calculating expression. "You don't recall meeting my sister, do you?" The direct question caught Grace off guard. According to records, I did meet her, but I was going through a difficult time then. My memories of that period are not entirely clear." "Convenient," Claire murmured, though without real malice. She turned to Ethan. "We'll continue this discussion tomorrow. I need to consult with some of Isabel's research colleagues about the specific language in her notes." After they departed, Ethan ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Grace had come to recognize as a sign of stress. "I'm sorry about that," he said. "Bennett is looking for any angle to support Claire's claim that Isabel intended half the estate to fund a specific marine conservation project. The timing is suspicious, given that the project is currently being run by Claire's husband." Grace shifted Sophie to her other hip, the baby beginning to fuss at the delay in their beach excursion. Do you think that's not what Isabel would have wanted? Ethan's expression softened as he reached out to smooth Sophie's hair. Isabel would have wanted to protect the oceans, that was her life's work, but she also believed in strategic, evidence-based conservation. This particular project hasn't published any peer-reviewed research in 3 years, he sighed. But proving what Isabel would have wanted is exactly the problem. The foundation paperwork was never finalized before she became too ill. What about the journal? Grace suggested. Surely her personal writings would provide some insight. That's what tomorrow's meeting is about. I've agreed to share relevant entries with Claire and her lawyer, though the idea of them picking through Isabel's private thoughts. He trailed off, visibly troubled by the prospect. Sophie chose that moment to express her impatience, more vocally, squirming in Grace's arms and reaching toward the floor. We should get going, Grace said. The tide will be perfect for the pools soon. Ethan nodded, then surprised her by asking, would it be all right if I joined you? I could use some fresh air, and I've been promising myself I'd spend more time with Sophie during the day. The request was so unexpected that Grace momentarily forgot the professional response. You want to come to the beach with us? A hint of uncertainty crossed Ethan's features. If it wouldn't be an intrusion. I understand this is part of your workday with Sophie. No, it's not an intrusion at all, Grace quickly assured him. Sophie would love having you there, we both would. The words slipped out before she could consider their implications, but Ethan's smile, a genuine, unguarded expression that transformed his entire face, made any embarrassment worth it. Give me 5 minutes to change, he said, already turning toward his private wing of the house. The beach cove was one of Whitmore Estate's most spectacular features, a small secluded stretch of sand, accessible only via a private path from the property. Natural rock formations created shallow tide pools teeming with marine life, perfect for a curious baby's explorations. Grace spread a blanket on the sand, while Ethan held Sophie, the baby pointing excitedly at seagulls wheeling overhead. The domestic tableau they created would have seemed improbable just months earlier. The reserved tech billionaire barefoot on the beach with his daughter, while the housekeeper set out a simple picnic lunch. Isabel loved this spot, Ethan said, carefully setting Sophie down on the blanket. She used to spend hours in those tide pools, cataloguing species and taking water samples for her research. Grace smiled, picturing the scene. I can see why, it's like a natural aquarium. They spent the morning introducing Sophie to the wonders of the tide pools, tiny crabs scuttling between rocks, colorful anemones waving their tentacles in the clear water, small fish darting in the shallows. Ethan proved to be surprisingly knowledgeable about the marine ecosystem, naming each creature they discovered with the confidence of someone who had absorbed this information through loving association. Isabel would quiz me, he explained when Grace commented on his expertise. She believed everyone should understand the ocean, especially those of us fortunate enough to live beside it. As the morning sun climbed higher, they retreated to the shade of the blanket for lunch. Sophie, exhausted from the excitement, fell asleep between them, her cheeks pink from the sea air. Thank you, Ethan said after a comfortable silence, his gaze fixed on the horizon where blue sky met bluer ocean. For what? Grace asked. For this, he gestured to encompass the scene. The sleeping baby, the peaceful cove, the simple pleasure of a morning spent in nature. I haven't felt this present in a very long time. Grace understood what he meant. Despite the complications swirling around them, Claire's claims, the mysterious foundation, the strange connection to Isabel, she couldn't. Remember, there was something undeniably right about this moment, a sense of alignment that transcended the unusual circumstances that had brought them together. Isabel wrote in her journal about wanting Sophie to grow up with a connection to the natural world, Grace said. Days like this are part of that legacy. Ethan nodded, his expression thoughtful. The foundation was supposed to be part of that legacy, too. Isabel wanted to establish something that would combine marine conservation with education, bringing children, especially from disadvantaged backgrounds, to experience the ocean firsthand. He looked at Grace. She believed early connections to nature created lifelong environmental stewards. That sounds like a beautiful vision, Grace said, one worth protecting. It is, Ethan agreed, and I want to honor it properly. That's why Claire's approach feels wrong, too narrow, too focused on a single project, rather than the broader mission Isabel described to me. As they gathered their things later, Sophie still sleeping peacefully in Ethan's arms, Grace felt a clarity she hadn't experienced in a long time. Whatever her forgotten connection to Isabel might be, she was certain of one thing. She was exactly where she needed to be, helping to protect not just Sophie, but the legacy her mother had envisioned for her. Walking back up the path to Whitmore Estate, the three of them bathed in golden afternoon light. Grace allowed herself to imagine just for a moment that this wasn't temporary, that this evolving connection between them might continue beyond her employment, beyond the boundaries that separated them. It was a dangerous thought, one she quickly set aside. But as Ethan turned to wait for her at a bend in the path, Sophie secure in his arms and his expression more peaceful than she had ever seen it, the thought refused to disappear entirely, instead settling somewhere deep in her heart, like a seed waiting for the right conditions to grow. Summer in Sydney brought longer days and warmer nights to Whitmore Estate. The gardens bloomed with native flora, their vibrant colours a backdrop to Sophie's increasingly mobile adventures. At 10 months old, she was pulling herself up on furniture and cruising along edges, determined to master walking before her first birthday. Grace watched her progress with pride that went beyond professional satisfaction. Though she tried to maintain appropriate boundaries, it became more difficult with each passing day, especially as Ethan continued his transformation from distant provider to engaged father. The three of them had fallen into comfortable rhythms that sometimes made Grace forget the true nature of her role in their lives. On this particular morning, Grace entered the kitchen to find Ethan already there, Sophie balanced on his hip as he attempted to prepare her breakfast one-handed. The sight, this powerful businessman, focused intently on mashing banana for his daughter, brought a smile to Grace's face. "Good morning," she greeted them, automatically moving to take Sophie. But Ethan shook his head. "We've got this under control, don't we, Sophie?" he said to the baby, who responded with a happy babble and a sticky hand against his cheek. "Though we might have underestimated the strategic complexity of banana management." Grace laughed, reaching for a cloth to wipe Sophie's hands. "Strategic complexity seems to be your specialty, from what I've read in the business pages. Tech mergers are nothing compared to a determined baby with fruit," Ethan replied with a grin. The easy banter between them had developed naturally over the past months, another shift in their evolving dynamic. Mrs. Whittaker entered the kitchen, her expression revealing surprise at finding Ethan engaged in such a domestic scene. "Mr. Caldwell, the representatives from the Attorney General's office have arrived for the Foundation meeting. They're waiting in the conference room." Ethan's expression sobered immediately. "Thank you, Mrs. Whittaker. Please offer them refreshments. I'll join them shortly." He handed Sophie to Grace, his fingers lingering for a moment where they brushed against her arm. "Today's the day. Final approval for the Hearthlight Foundation." Grace felt a flutter of anticipation. The foundation had become a central focus over the past weeks, as Ethan worked to honor Isabel's vision while resolving Claire's claims. The solution had emerged gradually, a compromise that incorporated Claire's research interests while maintaining the broader educational mission Isabel had described. "Nervous?" Grace asked, settling Sophie into her high chair. Ethan considered the question seriously. "Not about the foundation itself. The structure is sound, the mission clear, the funding secure." He hesitated. "It's what comes after that I'm uncertain about." Before Grace could ask what he meant, Mrs. Whittaker reappeared. "Sir, they're asking for Ms. Mitchell as well. Something about her role in the organizational structure." Grace froze, confusion evident on her face. "My role? I don't have a role in the foundation." Ethan's expression was unreadable. "Actually, there's something I've been meaning to discuss with you. It seems this morning's meeting has forced the issue." He turned to Mrs. Whittaker. "Please tell them we'll be there in 5 minutes." After the estate manager departed, Ethan took a deep breath. "I've included a position for you in the foundation's leadership structure, co-director of educational programs. It would involve developing curriculum for children visiting the Marine Research Center, coordinating with schools, designing hands-on learning experiences. The salary is competitive, and it comes with an apartment on the foundation campus." Grace stared at him, trying to process this unexpected development. "But I don't have qualifications in marine education or any formal education credentials." "You have something more valuable," Ethan said. "You have an innate understanding of how to connect with children, how to make them feel safe while encouraging their curiosity." I've watched you with Sophie. You're a natural teacher." He paused. "And your songs, the lullabies you've written, they could be incorporated into programs for younger children." The offer was overwhelming. "This seems very sudden." Ethan smiled ruefully. "Not as sudden as it appears. I've been considering it for weeks, ever since we found Isabel's journal, but I wanted to wait until the foundation was officially established before approaching you." "What about Sophie?" Grace asked, her heart constricting at the thought of separation from the baby she had grown to love. Something flickered in Ethan's eyes. Vulnerability, perhaps, or uncertainty. "That's the other thing I wanted to discuss. The foundation headquarters would be here at Whitmore. Part of the estate would be converted for research and educational facilities, but the main house would remain our home, Sophie's home." He took a step closer. "And yours too, if you wanted that." The implication of his words hung in the air between them. This wasn't simply a job offer. It was something more, something neither of them had dared to name explicitly. "Ethan, A gentle knock at the kitchen door interrupted them. Claire stood there, her expression softer than Grace had seen it before. "Sorry to intrude," she said, stepping into the kitchen. "The lawyer is getting impatient, and you know how they charge by the minute." Her gaze shifted to Sophie, who was happily smashing banana on her high-chair tray. "Hello, little one. You're looking more like your mother every day." The observation held no bitterness now, only a wistful affection. The weeks of negotiation over the foundation had gradually transformed Claire's antagonism into cautious cooperation. While she and Ethan might never be close, they had found common ground in honoring Isabel's wishes. "We're coming," Ethan assured her, then turned back to Grace. "We'll continue this conversation later." Grace nodded, her mind still processing the magnitude of what he had proposed. As Ethan and Claire left for the meeting, she remained with Sophie, mechanically cleaning the baby's messy hands while her thoughts raced. A position with the foundation, a home at Whitmore, a future with Ethan and Sophie. It was more than she had allowed herself to imagine, more than she had believed possible after everything she had lost. Later that afternoon, as Sophie napped in her crib, Grace sat in the sunroom with Isabel's journal open on her lap. She had taken to reading it occasionally, trying to understand the woman whose absence had shaped so much of life at Whitmore. Today, she turned to one of the final entries dated just days before Isabel's death. "My darling Sophie, today I signed the preliminary papers for what will someday become the Hearthlight Foundation. The name comes from something my grandmother used to say, that warmth begins with one kind act, like a hearth that can warm an entire home from a single flame. I won't see this dream realized in my lifetime, but I believe your father will carry it forward when he's ready, and I hope that by the time you're old enough to read these words, you'll be proud of what we've built. A legacy not of wealth or power, but of protection for the world you'll inherit, and education for those who will care for it alongside you. Love illuminates everything it touches, my sweet girl. Remember that. Always your mum, Isabel." Grace closed the journal, her decision crystallizing. Whatever her role at Whitmore might become, foundation director, friend, or something more, she would honor the legacy Isabel had envisioned, not just for the oceans she had loved, but for the daughter she had never known. The foundation meeting concluded successfully, with all parties signing the final documents that would establish the Hearthlight Foundation as a legal entity. As the lawyers and officials departed, Ethan found Grace in the garden with Sophie, who was practicing her newfound standing skills by gripping Grace's fingers and bouncing energetically. "It's official," he announced, his expression a mixture of relief and satisfaction. "Isabel's foundation is now a reality." "Congratulations," Grace said sincerely. She would be proud. Ethan knelt to Sophie's level, holding out his arms. The baby released Grace's fingers and wobbled precariously for a moment before falling forward into her father's embrace with a delighted giggle. "Did you see that?" Ethan exclaimed, looking up at Grace with wonder. "She stood on her own for a second." "She's been practicing all afternoon," Grace confirmed, her heart full, at witnessing this milestone moment shared between father and daughter. Ethan lifted Sophie into his arms and stood, his expression growing serious. "Have you had time to think about what I proposed? About the foundation position?" Grace nodded, suddenly nervous despite her decision. "I have, and I'd like to accept both the position and everything else it might entail." She met his gaze directly, allowing herself to be vulnerable in a way she hadn't been in a very long time. "I care about Sophie. And I care about you, Ethan, more than I should, perhaps, given my position here. Ethan's expression softened. There's no should about feelings, Grace, they simply are. He shifted Sophie to one arm and reached for Grace's hand with his free one. I never expected to find this. Again, this sense of possibility of family. After Isabel died, I thought that part of my life was over. But then you came, sleeping on the nursery floor with Sophie in your arms, and something woke up inside me that I thought was gone forever. The simple honesty of his words moved her deeply. I felt the same way, she admitted. After Melbourne, after everything that happened there, I didn't think I'd ever feel connected again. Sophie changed that, and so did you. They stood together in the garden, the three of them forming a tableau that would have seemed impossible months earlier. Above them, a flock of rainbow lorikeets passed in a blur of colour against the blue Australian sky. Their calls a celebration of life's persistent beauty, even in the midst of loss and change. So what happens now? Grace asked, still holding Ethan's hand. He smiled, the expression reaching his eyes in a way that transformed his entire face. Now we build something new, together, for Sophie, for ourselves, for the legacy Isabel believed in. As the sun began its descent toward the Pacific, painting Whitmore Estate in shades of gold and amber, Grace felt a sense of coming home, not to a place, but to a possibility she had once thought forever lost, the chance to love again, to create family, to find purpose in nurturing both a child and a vision larger than herself. And somewhere, perhaps, Isabel was smiling. 1 year later, Whitmore Estate had transformed in ways both subtle and profound. The East Wing now housed the Hearthlight Foundation's administrative offices, while newly constructed buildings near the beach contained state-of-the-art marine research facilities. The main house remained a private residence, though livelier than it had been in years, with Sophie's toys scattered throughout rooms once kept in pristine order. Today, the gardens were decorated for a special occasion, Sophie's second birthday celebration, combined with the official opening of the Foundation's Educational Center. Guests mingled on the lawn, marine scientists, local educators, Foundation donors, and a small circle of friends who had become like family over the past year. Grace moved among them, greeting arrivals and ensuring everything ran smoothly. As co-director of educational programs, she had been instrumental in developing the center's curriculum, incorporating music, hands-on exploration, and age-appropriate conservation concepts for children from toddlers to teenagers. The touch pools are a stroke of genius, commented Dr. Eliza Chen, the Foundation's lead researcher, as she joined Grace near the refreshment table. I've never seen children so engaged with marine biology concepts. Your approach makes science accessible without oversimplifying. Grace smiled, appreciating the validation from someone whose academic credentials far outshone her own. Children are naturally curious. We just need to create environments where that curiosity can flourish safely. Speaking of children, Eliza nodded toward the garden path. Here comes the birthday girl now. Sophie toddled toward them, her pace still somewhat unsteady but determined, with Ethan following, stay close behind. At 2 years old, she was a spirited child with her father's stormy eyes and an infectious laugh that could brighten the darkest day. "Mama!" Sophie called, spotting Grace and accelerating her wobbly progress. The word still gave Grace a moment's pause each time she heard it, a bittersweet reminder of the complex journey that had brought them to this point. When Sophie had first called her Mama 6 months earlier, Grace had gently tried to redirect her, conscious of Isabel's place in the little girl's life. But Ethan had stopped her. Isabel would want Sophie to have a mother's love, he had said quietly. Not a replacement for her, but an addition. Love isn't a finite resource. They had agreed that Sophie would know about Isabel, would grow up with stories, photographs and the journal entries appropriate for a child's understanding. She would know that she had been loved by her birth mother, with a fierceness that transcended death, and she would know that family could be both born and chosen, expanded rather than replaced. Now Grace knelt to catch Sophie in a hug, lifting her into her arms. "Are you enjoying your party, birthday girl?" Sophie nodded enthusiastically. "Cake soon?" Ethan laughed as he joined them, always focused on priorities, just like her mother. The comment held no sadness now, only fond remembrance mingled with present joy. Claire approached, carrying a beautifully wrapped gift. Her relationship with Ethan remained complicated. but her connection to Sophie had grown stronger over the past year. As the Foundation's research director, she worked closely with both Ethan and Grace, gradually building a cautious friendship based on shared goals and mutual respect. "Happy birthday, sweet girl," she said, presenting the package to Sophie, who accepted it with wide-eyed delight. "It's a junior marine biologist kit, custom-made, child-safe equipment for exploring tide pools, just what every 2-year-old needs." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Starting her recruitment early, I see." Claire smiled, a genuine expression that softened her features. Isabel would expect nothing less. Besides, Sophie has already shown excellent observation skills during our beach walks. As other guests gathered around to watch Sophie open her gifts, Grace felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to find Mrs. Whittaker beside her. The estate manager's usually composed features softened with emotion. "I just wanted to say," Mrs. Whittaker began, her voice lower than usual, "that Isabel would be pleased with all of this." She gestured to encompass not just the Foundation celebration, but the larger transformation of Whitmore Estate, from a place of silent grief to one filled with purpose and life. "Thank you," Grace replied, touched by this rare personal comment from the typically reserved woman. "That means a great deal coming from you." Mrs. Whittaker nodded, then added, "She had a gift for seeing possibilities in people, possibilities they sometimes couldn't see in themselves. It seems you share that gift." Before Grace could respond, the estate manager had moved on, returning to her duties with characteristic efficiency. But her words lingered, adding another piece to the puzzle of Grace's forgotten meeting with Isabel years earlier. Later, as the afternoon light began to soften into evening, most guests had departed, leaving only the closest circle for a more intimate family celebration. Sarah, Sophie's surrogate, had flown in from Adelaide with her husband and their young son, continuing the relationship that had begun when Ethan reached out to reconnect last year. They gathered on the terrace overlooking the ocean, where Ethan had arranged a small stage. Sophie sat on a colourful cushion at the front, her eyes wide with anticipation, as Grace took a seat at the keyboard. "As some of you know," Ethan said, addressing the small group, "Grace has been writing songs since before she came to Whitmore. Today, for Sophie's birthday, she's going to share something special, the first official Hearthlight Foundation song for our youngest visitors." Grace positioned her hands on the keys, her initial nervousness fading as she looked out at the faces of those who had become her family, chosen and created through circumstances none of them could have predicted. She began to play, and then to sing, her clear voice carrying in the evening air. "Beneath the waves a world awaits of coral dreams and starfish gates. The ocean holds such wonders deep, treasures for us all to keep. Little hands can make big change. Little hearts have love to share." Every voice, however small, joins the chorus, one and all. "From tiny seeds grow mighty trees, from single flames warm hearths arise. With kindness as our guiding star we'll light the way near and far." Sophie clapped delightedly when the song ended, immediately demanding, "Again! Again!" The adults laughed, and Grace obliged, this time encouraging everyone to join in on the chorus. As their voices blended together in the gathering twilight, she caught Ethan's gaze across the terrace. His expression held such tenderness that it momentarily took her breath away. Later, after Sophie had been put to bed with stories and lullabies, Grace stood on the cliffside path overlooking the ocean. The moon cast a silver path across the water, and the sound of waves breaking against the rocks below created a soothing rhythm in the darkness. She heard footsteps behind her and knew without turning that it was Ethan. His arms encircled her waist as he joined her, and she leaned back against his chest, comfortable in the closeness they now shared. "Quite a day," he said softly, his breath warm against her ear. She agreed. Sophie was so happy, and the educational center launch couldn't have gone better. "That's not what made it special, though," Ethan said. "It was having everyone together, Sarah and her family, Claire, the research team, Mrs. Whittaker, all the people who have become part of our story." Grace turned in his arms to face him. "Our story," she repeated, still sometimes amazed by the reality of those words. "I have something for you," Ethan said, reaching into his pocket. "I was going to wait until later, but this moment feels right." He withdrew a small velvet box, and Grace's breath caught. He opened it to reveal not a ring, as she had momentarily expected, but a pendant, a small, exquisitely crafted silver flame on a delicate chain. "The symbol of the Hearthlight Foundation," she said, recognizing the logo she had helped design. Ethan nodded, removing the necklace from its box. And something more, a reminder of what Isabel wrote, that warmth begins with one kind act. He moved behind her to fasten the chain around her neck. Your act of kindness that night in the nursery changed everything, Grace. For Sophie, for me, for all of us. Grace touched the pendant where it rested against her skin, warm from Ethan's hand. I was just doing what felt right in that moment. That's the thing about kindness, Ethan said, turning her to face him again. We rarely recognize its power when we're offering it. We just act from the heart without calculating the impact. Above them, the stars of the southern hemisphere blazed in the clear night sky, the same stars that had witnessed their first genuine connection a year and a half earlier, when a billionaire had walked into a nursery and found his housekeeper asleep on the floor, holding his baby in her arms. I love you, Grace said simply. You and Sophie, this life we've created together. Ethan's kiss was gentle but certain, a promise sealed beneath the vast Australian sky. And we love you. All of this, the foundation, the music, the future we're building, it exists because you refused to walk away from a crying baby during a storm. As they made their way back to the house, their home, Grace thought about the strange, winding path that had led her to this place. The losses that had nearly broken her in Melbourne, the fog of grief that had erased even her memory of meeting Isabel, the chance to begin again at Whitmore Estate, all of it had converged to create this unexpected life. In the nursery, they paused to check on Sophie, who slept peacefully in her toddler bed, surrounded by stuffed marine creatures. Claire's influence, evident even in the child's toy selection. The room that had once been so pristinely unused was now thoroughly lived in, with books stacked on shelves, artwork taped to walls, and a comfortable rocking chair where many stories had been read and songs sung. She'll change the world someday, Ethan whispered, gazing at his daughter, just like her mother. Both of them. Grace smiled at the generous inclusion, at the way Ethan had created space in their family narrative for both the mother Sophie had lost and the one she had found. In that generous spirit, in that refusal to let grief diminish the capacity for new joy, she recognized the true legacy that Isabel had left behind, not just in the foundation that bore her vision, but in the hearts she had touched, directly and indirectly. Some journeys begin with grand gestures or momentous decisions. Others start more quietly, with a woman sleeping on the floor of a nursery, cradling a baby against the storm, with a man standing frozen in a doorway, witnessing an act of simple kindness that awakens something long dormant within him, with two people from different worlds discovering that the surest path to healing sometimes lies in helping others find their way. As Grace and Ethan left the nursery hand in hand, the pendant at her throat caught the soft light from the hallway, its silver flame gleaming like a promise kept, like a hearth welcoming weary travelers home.